Welcome to Way Out of History. I'm your host, Aaron Baker, and I want to thank you for joining me for a journey that defies logic, explodes expectation, and leaves us wondering how something so improbable could have actually happened. This isn't your average World War II story. Today, we're traveling to the final days of a dying Nazi regime, to a little-known fortress in the Austrian Alps, and into the hearts of men, some labeled enemies, others heroes, who came together for one impossible stand. Castle Itter is more than just a place on a map. It's a symbol, a literal stronghold, yes, but also a metaphorical one. A place where ideals collided, where courage was tested, and where former foes chose unity over hatred. It's a story wrapped in a paradox. Americans fighting alongside Germans, high-ranking French prisoners taking up arms, and a Nazi officer who defied his superiors to save lives he once would have been ordered to sacrifice. But for me, this story goes deeper than tactics and timelines. It's about transformation, about redemption, about what happens when a person sees past their past, when they break free from the chains of ideology or personal destruction and make a choice to do what's right. As I tell you about Castle Itter, I'll also be sharing a bit of my own testimony, because history is at its best when it meets the present, when it convicts the soul, and when it shines light on the dark corners of our hearts. So, buckle up, my friends. We're heading to May 1945, just as Hitler's twisted dream was crashing down, and into the eye of a storm where hatred should have reigned, but brotherhood broke through instead. The setting was bleak. It was spring in Austria, and nature, as if unaware of human conflict, was blooming with fresh life. Yet the country was a fractured shell of itself. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich was in its death throes. Berlin lay in ruins, but across Europe, chaos still ruled. Soldiers were still dying. Executions were still happening. And in some regions, the war's most fanatical warriors, the SS, were just getting started on the finalized, frenzied rampage. Castle Itter, nestled in the Alps, was an unlikely prison. Built for nobility, its stone towers and fortified walls have become a gilded cage for some of France's most prominent figures. These prisoners weren't your average captives. They included former prime ministers, military generals, members of high society, and even the sister of Charles de Gaulle. The Nazis had kept them alive not out of mercy, but because they were useful, potential pawns in future negotiations, or shields for fleeing war criminals. Now with the regime crumbling, the SS had other ideas. Their orders were changing. Loose ends were being tied up. Evidence of war crimes was being eliminated. Castle Itter's prisoners knew this. They knew their lives hung in the balance. They were isolated, nearly forgotten, and waiting for a rescue that seemed more like a fantasy than any kind of possibility. It reminds me where I once found myself, not in a physical prison, but in a spiritual one. On the outside, I wore the mask well. I went to church, I played the part, but inside, I was bitter, controlling, even abusive. I had boxed myself into a fortress of anger, addiction, and though I didn't know it, I was waiting for a rescue too. Just like those French prisoners, I needed someone to break in and bring me out. Enter Joseph Gangel, a man at a moral crossroads, a decorated major. Gangel had fought for Germany throughout the war, but by 1945, his belief in the Nazi cause had crumbled. He wasn't blind. He had seen the atrocities, the suffering, the betrayal of everything honorable. And so, even as a man in uniform, he quietly began to resist, working alongside the Austrian resistance. He started to protect civilians in his hometown of Worgl. When Gangel heard about the situation at Castle Itter, he was confronted with a decision that would define his legacy. Should he risk everything, his life, his men, his reputation to try to save a group of French prisoners he didn't even know? Or should he play it safe and let history run its brutal course? His answer was simple. Though it would cost him dearly, he would act. What I find remarkable is the clarity that Gangel had in the fog of war. He saw people in danger. He saw a chance to help. He wasn't paralyzed by politics or past allegiance. He saw right and he saw wrong, and he chose the former, even if it meant teaming up with the enemy. He would later join forces with the Americans. Yes, the very men his army had been trying to kill for years. That hits me deeply, because I remember my own crossroads. My marriage was in pieces. My soul was fractured. I had been told point blank, get help or get out. I didn't know what to do, but at a moment of desperation, I turned to Facebook for help. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Facebook? How's that going to help? Believe it or not, God answered. Not with thunder or lightning, but through a man I didn't even know who invited me to go to a Christian retreat. Gangel reached out across enemy lines. I reached out across pride. And what came next changed both of our lives. On the other side of the collapsing front, Captain John Jack Lee was leading a small unit of American tankers. He was brash, he was bold, and he was a bit of a renegade, perfectly suited for the impossible. When Gangel approached Lee with the story of Castle Itter and the desperate prisoners, Lee didn't hesitate. No orders, no reinforcements, just a decision. Lee gathered a tiny force, just a few dozen men, a Sherman tank named Jenny, and a handful of Austrian resistant fighters. Together, this ragtag band set out toward the castle. They were driving straight into SS-held territory with minimal weapons, no backup, and a whole lot of faith. The odds? Very laughable. But for Lee, Gangel, and their men, it wasn't about the odds. It was about doing what was right. That image, that tank rumbling up the alpine roads toward an unknown fate is burned into my mind, because that retreat I went to, that was my Sherman tank. I had no idea what would happen. I didn't really know or trust many of the people around me. I didn't even trust myself. But I knew I couldn't stay where I was. I had to go forward. I had to take a risk. And just like Lee and Gangel, when I stepped into the unknown, I found something waiting that I never expected. Hope. Real hope. Not just survival, but transformation. And that's the heartbeat of Castle Itter. Not just military strategy or daring, but the courage to step out in faith, even when everything tells you to turn back. When the defenders arrived at Castle Itter, they didn't walk into a secure stronghold. They walked into a time bomb. The USS had surrounded the area. Supplies were scarce. The French prisoners, many elderly and frail, were terrified. The castle was ancient and beautiful, but it was also vulnerable, a fortress against the past, but not against mortars and machine guns. Lee and Gangel quickly took command. They assessed the castle's defenses, organizing firing positions, and prepared the prisoners for a fight. It was very unprecedented. Generals and prime ministers were handed rifles. They took up positions beside American soldiers and a few German defectors. Every man knew what was coming. The SS would attack, and when they did, it would be with the fury of a regime desperate to leave no witnesses. And yet, what happened next was extraordinary. These former enemies, men who had once hated or mistrusted one another, began to work together. French prisoners, American soldiers, and German troops formed a unified defense. Walls that had once separated them in ideas and culture began to crumble, and their place, trust, began to grow. That's what healing often looks like. At that Christian retreat, I sat in a room with men I would have never associated with. I confessed my sins I had never voiced. I cried in front of strangers, and instead of judgment, you know what I got? I got grace. The defenses I have built over my years, my castle walls, started to come down. God wasn't just saving me, He was rebuilding me. May 5th, 1945. cold and tense over the Alps. At the castle, the defenders, a bizarre coalition of American soldiers, Austrian partisans, a few renegade German troops, and the elite French prisoners were bracing themselves. They had survived the night, but the real fight was just beginning. The SS forces surrounding the castle had regrouped and preparing for a full assault. The castle was aging, but beautiful, was never designed to withstand modern warfare. The defenders had one tank, dwindling ammunition, and barely enough manpower to man all the key positions. Captain Lee quickly divided up the defense of the castle. He placed his Sherman tank, affectionately named Jenny, at the front gate as both a symbol and literal blockade. The French prisoners, though elderly and mostly untrained, insisted on helping. The former Prime Minister and tennis champion Joe Borato took up arms alongside the Americans. Gengel's troops watched over the southern approach, the most likely vector for a breach. Communication was very spotty. Reinforcements were uncertain, and every man in the castle knew they might not survive the day. What makes this most remarkable, and honestly emotional for me, is that these were men who should have hated each other. Americans, Germans, French, former enemies who had mere months before been on opposite sides of the most brutal war in history. But here, they are united, not by nationality, but by moral clarity. They saw the SS for what it was, a merciless, dying force to kill anyone to protect its own legacy. And in that moment, none of the old allegiances mattered. What mattered was doing the right thing, even if it cost everything. I think about the castle often when I reflect on my own struggles. When I stood at the edge of my life's collapse, I felt like those men, surrounded by forces I couldn't control. Rage, addiction, guilt. My own version of the SS storming the gates. But I found that when I surrendered to Jesus, He didn't just give me peace. He gave me a new band of brothers, men and women who stood beside me, prayed for me, held me accountable, and reminded me of grace. And like at Castle Itter, I found strength in unexpected allies. As the battle intensified, Joseph Gengel continued to move among the defenders. Though a former major, he wasn't barking orders. He wasn't hiding behind rank. He was leading by example, checking positions, moving supplies, encouraging terrified civilians sheltering in the castle's cellar. He had chosen this path, not loyalty to a crumbling regime, but service to truth. And that choice would soon cost him everything. A sniper's bullet shattered the tense rhythm of the firefight. One of the French VIPs, the former Prime Minister, was caught in the crossfire as he attempted to reach a safer position. Without hesitation, Gengel ran out into the open to pull him back. In full view of the enemy, Gengel dove for the minister and dragged him behind cover. In doing so, he exposed himself and was fatally shot through the head. Gengel died instantly, the first and only defender to fall in the battle for Castle Itter. Gengel's death stunned everyone. Here was a man who had been part of the German war machine, now laying down his life to protect a French political prisoner. His sacrifice became a turning point, not just tactically but spiritually. The defenders rallied with renewed resolve. They would not let Gengel's death be in vain. For those who survived, his courage reminded them of the defining memory of that day. And for historians, it remains one of the clearest examples of moral redemption in modern warfare. When I hear this part of the story for the first time, I was just taken back, because I knew what it felt like to be part of the problem, part of the pain I had inflicted on others. I thought I had gone too far to ever be redeemed. But Jesus didn't see me that way. He saw the broken soldier in me, the one who still had a chance. And just like Gengel, he stepped into the line of fire to rescue me. Gengel's sacrifice paints a powerful picture of the gospel. Gengel didn't save someone because they were worthy. He saved someone because it was right. And that's what love looks like. And that reflects what Jesus did for me and what he did for you. He didn't save me because I was worthy or because I was righteous. He saved me because he loved me, because he came to seek and save that which was lost. Gangel essentially did the same thing. Reinforcements from the 142nd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Division finally arrived by late afternoon. The sound of their trucks and tanks sent panic throughout the SS lines. With dwindling ammunition and morale shattered by the defenders' resolve and Gangel's martyrdom, the SS broke off their assault and retreated into the woods. For the first time in days, the castle fell silent. The siege was over. The defenders had won, against the odds, against logic, and against history itself. The liberation of Castle Itter was quickly overshadowed by the total German surrender just 3 days later. But for those who were there, that battle left a permanent imprint. The French prisoners were evacuated safely. The American and Austrian forces returned to their units. Captain Jack Lee was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his bravery, and Joseph Gangel was honored by the Austrians, his name forever etched into the memory as a hero of the people. Yet what lingered most wasn't the tactical victory. It was the sense of spiritual clarity that had emerged. In that brief battle, the world had seen enemies become friends, pride give way to humility, and war give way, just for a moment, to grace. Itter became a symbol of what's possible when we refuse to let hatred write the final chapter. For me, this part of the story hits home because it reminds me that true deliverance isn't always flashy. Sometimes it looks like survival. Sometimes it looks like standing your ground. Other times, it looks like holding on to hope when everything tells you to let it go. In my journey, deliverance didn't come all at once. It came in waves, through hard conversations, painful confessions, quiet prayers, and the steady works of grace. Castle Itter reminds me that even in the final hours, God can still turn things around. And if he can do that for a war-ravaged castle in Austria, he can do that for me, and he can do that for you too. For decades, the Battle of Castle Itter was barely a footnote in history books, overshadowed by the fall of Berlin and the surrender of Nazi Germany. This bizarre but powerful skirmish was tucked away in the dusty margins of World War II lore. Only in recent years has it started to receive the attention it deserves, as historians and storytellers rediscover its unique message. Think about that. A story of unity, courage, and sacrifice nearly lost in time. How many moments like that lie buried in the past? How many stories of people doing the right, often quietly, and great cost, remain unsung? I believe we need to uncover them, not just for history's sake, but for ours, because these stories show us what's possible even in the worst of circumstances. When I consider Castle Itter, I see more than a military operation. I see a spiritual parable, enemies becoming allies, broken systems yielding to human conscience, people risking their lives not out of duty but out of love. It's the kind of thing that doesn't make sense without a higher truth, without grace. In my own life, there are moments I wish could be forgotten, moments I hope people never remember. But when God redeems a life, he redeems the story too. What I once wanted buried has now become testimony. What was once shame has become fuel for others' healing. And just like Castle Itter is no longer a footnote, it's a headline. History has other rare moments where enemies put down their weapons and choose peace, if only for a moment. One of the most famous is the Christmas truce of 1914 during World War I. Soldiers from opposing sides climbed out of their trenches, shook hands, sang carols, and even played soccer in no man's land. It was brief. It was unsanctioned. But nonetheless, it was real. These events remind us that even in the darkest hours, the human spirit longs for connection, for something deeper than politics or commands. I think God wired us that way. We're made in his image. relational, redemptive, designed for reconciliation. War may be a product of the fall of humanity, but peace, I believe, is a glimpse of the kingdom. There was also the Berlin Airlift in 1948 to 1949. It was less violent, but it was just as powerful. As the Soviets tried to starve West Berlin into submission, American and Allied forces dropped supplies, food, coal, medicine by plane every day for months. They weren't dropping bombs. They were dropping hope. A different kind of warfare. A fight to give life, not take it. That's the kind of battle I want to be a part of. Not tearing people down, but building them up. Not winning arguments, but winning souls. And sometimes the fiercest fights are the ones for forgiveness, for choosing grace when resentment seems easier. I've had to fight those fights, especially with people I've hurt. It's humbling, but it's holy. Faith doesn't always come before the fire. Sometimes faith is forged in it. At Castle Itter, the defenders didn't expect heroism. They weren't trained for unity, but when that moment came, they rose. Not because they had all the answers, but because they chose what was right. I've seen that in my own journey. I didn't walk into that Christian retreat wanting to be a hero. I walked in broken, angry, scared. I didn't know how to pray really, much less lead it. But I cried out, and Jesus met me there, not with lightning bolts or a burning bush or a booming voice, but with conviction, with truth and grace, and that changed everything. Since then, I've learned that fire doesn't stop after the first breakthrough. In fact, sometimes it gets a whole lot hotter. Old habits try to resurface. Old lies whisper again. But that's where faith is refined. It's where identity gets tested. And it's where you choose day after day to trust the one who saved you. Castle Itter reminds me that we don't need perfect conditions to act with courage. We just need the conviction to stand, whether in a literal war zone or a spiritual one. The battlefield belongs to God, and He equips those who say yes, even when they're terrified. Maybe today you're in a castle of your own, feeling surrounded. The enemy is closing in and your strength is nearly gone. Maybe it's addiction. Maybe it's depression. Maybe it's a marriage that's falling apart like mine was. Or even a secret that nobody knows. You're holding the line, but barely. I've been there. And let me tell you something. You're not alone. The same God who showed up at Castle Itter, through courage, through sacrifice, through impossible unity, is still showing up today. He showed up in my life. At a retreat I didn't even want to attend. And He's here now, whispering that you're not too far gone. I'm here to say my story is far from perfect. It's messy. I was a church kid who knew the right words but didn't live them. I was a husband who caused pain instead of healing. I was a father who needed to become a different man. And I still have battles, but now I fight them with Jesus, not by willpower, but by surrender. So whatever your castle is, I want you to hear this. There is hope. There is help. There is healing. There is Jesus. And it doesn't depend on your performance. It depends on His promise. He's not done with your story, and this isn't the end. It just might be the beginning. Thanks for joining me on Way Out of History. Today we didn't just walk through a forgotten battle. We saw a picture of redemption, both past and present. I'm Aaron Breaker, and I pray this story moves you the way it moved me. Keep digging, keep remembering, and never forget, even in the darkest chapters of history, there's still light. Never forget that Jesus loves you. We'll see you next time.